Hello, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, a podcast about the classical world put on by three guys who work at a classical Christian school in Austin, Texas. My name is Graham Donaldson, and I am joined here with Thomas Fletcher Magby.
Hello.
And Arthur Jan Hannenberg.
Hello.
And gentlemen, I am contractually obliged to greet you both because that is my sworn duty that I have to perform, or else my virtue is besmirched. Or maybe I understand duty incorrectly, and that's probably the case. Hannenberg, what does it mean to have duties and responsibilities? And stop giggling at the word.
Sorry, it's funny every time you say it. It's very funny. Yeah, it's good.
When it was just my birthday. I am now 34. And the word duty still makes me
still good.
Like, is it ever going to come to
no, it means you're young at heart. This is a good thing about you.
You will be a jolly old man.
Yes.
I hope so. For the record, I think Magby was giggling more than I was.
That's a fair point. I mean, he is the youngest.
Yeah, which means I can be the most immature. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
For sure. Okay, today we are going to talk about Book 1 of Cicero's On Duty.
It's funny every time.
I'm
so sorry.
Rise
I can't
above,
get over
gentlemen.
I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry.
It's going to be a hard podcast. Sorry.
Yeah, it really is going to be a rough one. So we're doing Book 1 of Cicero's On Duty. I plan this to be a 3-parter because the real kicker, the real fun part comes on part 3. Right? So his book On Duty is divided into 3 sections. 1 considers what is right and good for men to do, what is our duty. Book 2 considers what is expedient, and then Book 3 considers how do we deal with it when what is expedient and what is right seem to conflict with one another?
Ooh. So by duty, does he say the duty that is all for all men from all time? Like, does he sort of generalize it to human duties to, X, Y, and Z, state, family, friends?
Yeah, kind of.
I've never read it, so I have no idea.
Yeah,
Same.
I'll get there.
Okay,
so let's talk about who Cicero was first, just to give our audience a little bit of background into who this fellow was. He was born in 106 BC and lived to 43 BC. So quite a little while, right? He's an old guy. I think Jesus Christ lived, 33 AD-ish? Around there?
Zero
was his... But I don't think that's right. I think he was born in 3 BC. I think it was a little bit off.
Yeah. But the whole idea being that 0 in theory is when he was born and 33 is when he died. But yes, it's not exactly right.
Right. So he's a little before Christ,
right,
but really stinking close. Yeah. He's close to that period. He served and this is just going to be a brief overview. This podcast isn't about Cicero himself. I just kind of want to give you an idea of who the fella is. He served as consul in the year 63 BC, which is a pretty high spot in the old Roman Republic. He came from a wealthy family, so he didn't have struggles as a young man. He routinely held positions on his way climbing the ranks. He championed a return to the Republican government following the death of Caesar. He was an enemy of Mark Antony in the power struggle after Caesar's death. For those who aren't as familiar with Julius Caesar, he rose to power and there were a bunch of folks that didn't like him very much. They stabbed him on the 15th of March and then claimed a return to the Republic. That wasn't what turned out. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's cronies, decided to seize the power for himself, and then it devolved into a civil war.
If you want to hear more, go back to our episode on Julius Caesar, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't it on? Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
But for those
who are new. Really fun
new,
Battle of Actium, and then Cleopatra, she leaves halfway through, and oh man.
Oh, there's so much cool stuff right around this period. He lived at one of the most exciting and well-known periods of Roman history, right at the death of Caesar. And he, in fact, was fleeing the peninsula, the Italian peninsula, when he was caught. And his head was cut off, and his hands were then displayed in the public forum.
Oh, geez.
Wow.
Which is rough.
Yeah.
Super rough.
Yeah. He got marked down as an enemy of the state in 43 BC because he had spoken sort of against Mark Antony. And this book, On Duty, was written in the last year of his life. So kind of when this was all going down was when he wrote this letter to his son. This is actually what the entire book is. It's a letter to his son as his son studies. And he says, look, I've done a lot of speaking. My stuff on rhetoric is important, but also I'm a pretty good philosopher. So check out all my philosophy. It'll be good for your development if you read it and you kind of follow me in these things. It's weird to hear a father tell a son, I've been pretty awesome. Just be like me. And
depends on your dad, I guess.
It depends on your dad, but there's a lot of dads who are like, don't make the same mistakes I made. He's like, do exactly what I did. I'm pretty great.
Except he got his hands cut off. I mean, like,
But for championing the Republic,
Sure.
something
Right.
that was good, right? And trying to oppose tyrants. It was all good.
It was like a good cause.
Yeah. He was actually invited to be the fourth member of the first triumvirate.
Oh, wow.
For those who don't know what that was, it was Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Those three fellas were all part of a power structure that ruled Rome for a good long time until Crassus died, leaving just two fellas. And when there's just two, usually one will try to steal preeminence. So he was actually invited to be the fourth guy in that, and
He said
turned
no?
them down
Really? Wow.
because he thought it would undercut the Republic and the Senate, and he didn't want to do that. So he's a pretty great guy. And his last words, these are famed his last words, after he got caught, he said, "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly." And he stuck out his neck and let them kill him. He didn't resist.
That's a good,
Aw, that's
a good last
awesome.
line. Yeah.
Isn't that awesome? And then his writings were actually really influential all the way through the rest of history. He was admired by the church fathers, Augustine of Hippo, and who credited one of his books for his eventual conversion to Christianity. Saint Jerome, who had a vision where he was accused of being a follower of Cicero and not of Christ before the
wow.
judgment seat. And he liked him enough
Right.
that a dream where he's like, you follow Cicero too much was deeply
needed that.
disturbing to
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
The influence when they sort of discovered all of his writings thought that maybe that's one of the things that led to the Italian Renaissance was rediscovering Cicero. And he had such a great influence on Latin language and learning that most style decisions were either said to be a returning to Cicero or a fleeing from Cicero. Wow. So he was sort of the benchmark that everything else went towards or ran away from.
Didn't you talk about him on a style episode? Do we still have his works on how to speak, how to write?
I think I'd have to look.
I don't remember.
I haven't read as much Cicero as I need. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this.
But because like the book that Augustine read that led to his conversion, we don't have that book.
correct.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that one is lost. I
Yep.
think it's his Hortensius.
I don't-
Something
I don't
like
know.
that. Yeah, we don't have that one, and so it's sad that we have lost some things, but there you go. And before I jump into this, I would like to remind our listeners that we are generalists, that I am...
Are you worried about what you're about to say?
Yeah, I'm doing my best
Okay.
to grok everything that he's saying and do a decent overview. But remember, this is philosophy. So this isn't exactly the easiest of reads, and it's pretty dense, which means that if I'm going to go over 100 pages of this in an hour,
Is that how long this is? Is it like super long?
that's book one. It's a pretty long
okay.
book.
Wow.
And I don't feel up to the task having not studied this at extreme length, right? I haven't taught this book for 12 years. I'm not a Cicero scholar. I just feel kind of humbled by coming to this. So if you're a little confused, just know that that's because
So are you?
I'm confused.
Good.
and I hope you can be okay with that as we try to jump into Cicero here. So like I said, it's a letter to his son Marcus, and he says, "Look, you've been studying for a while. I think it would be good for you to continue to study philosophy." In another book to his son, he says, "I wish the only thing you would hear was moral philosophy, because that is good for your development." And what parent has said that to their kids these days? I wish
never.
the thing that you deal with most is moral philosophy. When to be good and right, and in what situations to do those things.
I'm being unfair. I mean, doesn't every parent wants their kid to make good choices, but
But when
not,
they're advocating for school, what do they
Right.
say to go to school for?
not moral philosophy.
Yeah, not most of the
practical
time. If
skill.
your kid chooses philosophy as a major, you are deeply disturbed because you assume they're not going to get a job.
Right. Sure.
You might be right that they might not get a job, but at least
Hey,
they'll be content,
I did
right?
philosophy as a major.
Then you did a master's degree,
Yeah, that's true. But I did
But it
it
still
in
worked
more
out for
philosophy.
you. Yeah, exactly.
and I think your parents would rightly be alarmed that you are now a teacher and
What?
not making gobs of money.
Oh, they are not alarmed at all. My parents are. They are gushingly proud.
Good.
I know
As they
you
should
come
be.
from a teaching family, but I think there's a lot of parents out there who'd be like, "My son, a teacher? Never."
Dang.
No, I'm just kidding.
I'm so
Okay.
sorry. I'm so sorry, Graham.
Let's jump right into this. So, like I said, his first book is a sort of a study of what is right for men to do. And he says that there are two levels of morality: absolute duty and mean duty. Now, absolute duty has Are we going to do this the whole
entire time.
I'm
100%,
sorry. That's
yeah.
my only one. I'm done.
There's no
You
way.
can't
You're
claim
gonna be
that.
laughing
There's
the
no
entire
way that's
time.
the only
yeah,
one.
Absolutely.
All right. One is
Look,
now you got
this
me
first one
giggling.
is just absolute
All right.
duty. Okay.
Mean duty.
Yeah, it's just a mean duty.
All right. Sorry, I apologize. Listeners.
I don't apologize. I'm sorry.
Oh, what are we going to do? You guys, I feel like our podcast up until now has been a great thing to pad our resumes. And this right here is the one where they're like, we're never hiring those guys. Well, or maybe I'm only fit to teach ninth graders.
I was going to say, this is just the proof that we work with high schoolers, right?
Yes,
Yeah. What do you, yeah. But the thing is, never mind. All right, we're getting off track.
Good.
Let's get back to the duty. Sure. So one is the absolute duty has to do with what is the supreme good, which maybe we don't argue about a lot now, but we used to argue about a lot in the old days. Like, what is it good for men to do? Is the supreme good to seek pleasure? Is it to live in harmony with one's nature? Is one nature against harmony? Right? What is it good for men to do? Should it be to sacrifice all for the good of your brethren? Is it to seek self? There are still people who say...
Are those the ones he raises? Does he raise those?
He actually doesn't treat the supreme good much at all.
Oh, interesting.
He kind of glosses over that and moves on, partially because this isn't intended to be a discussion of what is the supreme good. He tosses a couple out. He says, if you live for the supreme pleasure, well, that doesn't work because what about justice? He just kind of undercuts them with like, well, here's a quick example why that can't be the supreme good and why you can only go for yourself. And it either means you won't fight as a soldier, which is dishonorable, or you won't adhere to justice, which is also dishonorable, or you won't do any good for your fellow man. He sort of undercuts those and he says, in any case, it has to adhere to virtue, right? It should have something to do with virtue. And so he doesn't treat long on what the supreme good is. But the mean duty, right? Mean good is how all of that, the supreme good, plays out into our lives, right? What does that mean for every situation? Right?
When he says mean, is he meaning like the median, the average, the mean? Like when we talk about halfway between two
I don't
points?
think so.
Oh, okay.
I think for mean good, he means just
it's like the actions you have to do.
Mean versus exalted.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? So
basic.
So like
pedestrian, basic or pedestrian or day-to-day, right? That's what he means by those.
So not like the golden mean or the, okay.
Yeah. And then he says, what is clear is that when considering something, you consider two things, whether it is right and whether it is expedient, right? And sometimes those two seem opposed and it will send you into a tailspin, right? Consider one of our students who has, say, accidentally stepped on my bookshelf and broken a piece off of it when I'm not in the room. That didn't happen. I was there when it happened.
At your shelf.
But he has two options. What is right for him to do?
Tell you.
Probably tell me that it happened. What is expedient for him to do?
Run away and
pretend it was not him, right?
Or try to fix the bookshelf as quickly as possible that you never notice.
Right.
Yeah, so sometimes those seem to be at odds, and they bring us into a bit of a moral conundrum, right? What is right versus what is good for me as a person? And we're going to treat that longer in my third part of this series, but that's kind of where he puts it. He also says that we can't just consider those three heads, good, expedient, and what if they're opposed? But we also have to consider, well, what if two things seem good? Which one should I go for? Right? What is more good than another?
Right.
So there's really 5 headings, right? So the moral, which is what is right, and then is one thing more right than another. The expedient, right? What is expedient? And then what if one thing can bring you more goods than the other thing can? And then lastly, what if they're opposed? Right? Those are the sort of the 5 headings under which this whole discourse will rest. Then he moves on to discussing duty specifically.
Yeah, now you're laughing.
I know. I'm sorry. Well, it's because you guys looked so serious, and I thought for sure that
I'm very
one
serious about duty.
would get you. All right. He says that all that is right arises under 4 kind of subheadings. And these 4 subheadings come early and they're easy to miss, but then the rest of the entire book rests under these 4. Cicero has this thing where he'll say, it's one of these 4 things, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it turns out that's the structure for the entire rest of the chapter. And if you missed it, you're just kind of hosed. So you have to really pay attention to when he delineates these things. The first is all that is right arises from, number 1, a full perception and development of the true. This is unique to mankind. Right? Animals don't do this. They don't seek what is true about the universe and then try to develop that in themselves. We, uniquely to the animal kingdom, have reason. In fact, even for Cicero, there seems to be a very sharp difference between animal and human, right? He says we have reason, we can appreciate beauty, we have fraternity, we sacrifice for the good of our neighbor. A lot of these things animals do not do, right? They won't stand and watch a sunset and appreciate its beauty, and then furthermore, ponder what that means about their inner soul. Animals just don't do that. This is unique to man. And he says there are two errors we must avoid when pursuing this. This might actually be the shortest part of his entire book here, is this, considering what is true and developing it. Number one, we must not treat the unknown as known and too readily accept it. And number two, some devote too much industry and too deep a study to matters that are obscure and difficult and useless. What do you guys think of those?
The second one made me laugh just because, like, that's how we find podcast episodes.
You think so?
No, I'm just joking. But that first one, we must not treat things that are unknown as known, is sounds very classical, sounds very Roman, and sounds like very sort of pragmatic area of philosophy. Is that there are things that we don't know, and if we think that we know them, we're going to be fools. It's almost sort of stoic in that way.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, I think that people fall into this trap all the time.
All the time.
Sure.
We see news stories and then we think we know everything about a thing and that we don't. We think we understand how the U.S. government works when a lot of us don't. And I think one of the even hardest is assuming we know something about a person because of some instance that we've extrapolated something from.
Yeah.
And the worst part of that is that if we write them off, we will never know the truth, right? We will never know who they were and get to know them a little more, which is hard. Right.
It's sometimes called the narrative fallacy, which is if we can make a story around it, whether it's true or not, we'll believe it. So we are more prone to believe things that sound coherent, whether they are or not.
Yeah. Okay. And then he moves on. Like I said, it's the shortest of the four. The second thing that all right arises from is the conservation of an organized society. So the first one is development of the truth and seeking the true, like universal truths. The second is just making sure society goes. And there are two divisions here. Justice, which he defines as keeping one man from doing harm to another and leading men to use common possessions for common interests and private possessions for their own. And the foundation for all of this is fidelity to promises and agreements.
Wow.
The second is charity. So under conservation of an organized society, we have justice and we have charity. And he goes through a in-depth discussion of both. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble talking this morning.
So what's the definition that he gives of justice?
Like I said, to keep one man from doing harm to another and to lead men to use common possessions for common interests and private possessions for private interests. So I wouldn't throw a party in the public square and then kick people out of the public square, right? And I wouldn't use a public building for my own good, and I wouldn't try to use my own home for public good, right? It's mine. It stays separate.
Did you say this is written to his son?
Yes.
So is his son going into politics?
I think he is assuming that his son is going into politics.
One day.
He actually goes into a discussion of the choosing of one's vocation later and gives a bunch of prescriptions there about how to do it and how to do it well. But I think he wants his kid to come forward in politics just as he was. And I think that's just going to be difficult considering the political climate. I don't know.
Back then, you're saying?
Considering right when Cicero died.
Right, exactly.
Like his kid isn't exactly going to be a shoo-in for stuff in the new regime.
Because Cicero was killed for political reasons.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And who knows what's coming around the corner, right? Like if you're in this time of giant political upheaval, they don't know that what's going to happen is a sort of succession of emperors with supreme power, and that the Congress as they know, not Congress, the
Senate.
The Senate as they know it is going to be powerless, toothless. And it's kind of, there's almost like a little ironic tragedy in the fact that he's writing a letter, but his son is going to be entering into a time where a lot of what his father became an expert in is no longer going to be immediately practical, even though the timelessness of this kind of, to be that kind of person, even if you exist in a time where that kind of person is derided, or mocked, to still be that kind of person, is admirable. I think all teachers need to believe that as well. That we can't just look to what is the practical for what a student is going to experience in life. Oh well, we're a highly technological world, so all we need to really do is get our students proficient to deal with a fluctuating world of technology. I mean, it's like falling into that first category, the thinking something is known when it is in fact unknown. So preparing the student to be able to be any kind of, or to be a good man in any kind of situation, any kind of waters. Anyway.
Which is also why I'm glad he'll go into the expedient in the second section, right? But he's starting with the moral.
He starts with the moral, yeah.
So I like that.
How to do what is
Right.
right towards you and your fellow men.
Before you get to what actually is practical. I don't know how he'll define it, but
I don't know either. I'm excited for it. Cool. All right. So he talks about two kinds of injustice. We're still under the heading of conservation of an organized society. And one is those who inflict wrong. And two is those who don't prevent wrong when they see it being inflicted upon others. And he actually brings philosophers under this category pretty often. They know what wrong is, but they remove themselves from everyday life under the guise of pursuing knowledge above all else. But then when they see something going wrong, they don't step in. They don't attempt to change things, right? They don't save anybody. And he kind of roundly says that's not okay. It's not okay for people to do. He also says that wealth is fine, but angling for it while also going for power is dangerous. It means that you will probably end up doing injustices for personal gain. Mm-hmm. He also talks about war, that it should only be made that we can live in peace, and only after a formal warning is given. And then he gives lots of stories about how one should conduct oneself in war, right? We should, if we give a promise in war, we should follow it. And he gives examples of soldiers who their soldier oath was revoked and said that they could go home, and they wanted to continue fighting, but they could not fight the enemy until they were legally a soldier, and so stood there and waited for someone to re-swear them in as soldiers so they could fight. There are also stories, and this has happened multiple times, where someone is a prisoner of war of a king, and the king says, look, the other side has some of my prisoners. I need you to go to your people under the oath of returning to me, and see if you can exchange yourself for my people that are over there. The story, I forget the name of the guy who did this, but he came over, preached, and said, you guys should not return the prisoners to this king. He is terrible. You keep them and you forget about me. And then he climbed back on his boat and he returned to a torture by death, like a death by torture. Yep. That is intense. Yep. And that's happened more than once in the history of Greece.
It was Roman general. I don't remember the name, but I've heard the story before.
Yeah, it's true. He did it. He came back and said, keep the soldiers. I'm heading back. Yep. And there's another time when there were 10 prisoners that did the same thing, and one tried to run away, and everybody thought he was horrible because he made a promise, even to an evil enemy. And also, if an enemy has conducted himself honorably, there was one guy who came and said, I will be a traitor. I will poison his drink and kill him. And they took him and they gave him up to their enemy and said, you've conducted yourself honorably. This guy was going to kill you with poison.
Well,
you should smoke him. He's no good. So there was sort of a respect among enemies even during that time.
Well, it was like John McCain when he was a prisoner of war during Vietnam. His dad was the supreme commander of the Navy or something, and so the Vietnamese wanted to release him, basically to show that he wasn't strong enough or whatever, just almost as a shame, and he refused to be released, and he stayed in the POW camp with his fellow soldiers and stuff. I mean, you look at that and you say that is somebody who is that is a noble and gallant action. That is doing one's duty.
I can't imagine returning home.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
And then preaching against the deal that would set me free,
right?
And then going back to death. Like that's insane, and it would take so much courage. Yeah. And I don't know.
You would do that.
I would like to think that I would do that, but my courage has never been tested in that situation.
But the person does that knowing that the home is going to honor him. Like, I think that's got to be part of it. If you went and everyone was
made fun of you for doing
it, or really did forget you and didn't care anything about you and didn't sing your song or didn't make any sort of didn't make any kind of effort to tell your story of the honor that you did, I think that would be a lot harder to do if you knew that your people kind of, if they thought that you were being a fool too. Like, if that was me, I'd run away. Mm-hmm.
That's Pericles at the end of the funeral oration where he says that the greatest rewards go to the most honorable. Yeah. Like you almost need that to reinforce the honor.
Right.
It's a separate discussion then of, is it honorable if you're getting rewarded for it? But maybe that's just a thing to think about at some point.
Yeah. All right. So to review, the subdivisions of duty is a full perception and development of the true, and conservation of an organized society. And so far we've talked about justice, and we're moving on to charity. Mm-hmm.
Is this a section I've only seen Cicero read in in quotations? Is this where he says like the greatest the greatest thing that mankind can do under worshiping the gods is to organize a government or something like that. I remember there's a famous Cicero quote where he says, the good thing that humans do together is that they organize civilized society. And this sort of sounds like where it would fit in.
That sounds right. I highlighted a ton when I was reading this. And so pulling out, there are some books that I read and there's not a single quote that really jumps out to me. Mm-hmm. This is one of those things where a good chunk of it is quotable.
Is it worth knowing who translated it or what edition you had?
I had the Kindle edition.
Yeah. So it was translated by Dr. Kindle?
By Dr. Kindle, yeah.
There is what's it called? Anyone can access it online. libertyfund.org was the first one I found. So
this one is translated by Walter Miller.
And so is it like a Penguin edition? Is it
It's the Kindle edition?
The Kindle edition. Kindle.
The Andrew Peabody is in public domain.
Oh man, I mean, if your last name's Peabody, I figure
it's a good translation.
Like in the classical world, that just sort of sounds like somebody who knows what's up.
Who know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Who would have a really killer translation of Cicero, but might not be too much fun at a dinner party.
Yeah.
Know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to charity. Uh-huh. We're only about halfway through. We got to hustle.
Let's do it.
All right. He gives us some principles for exercising our charity. Number 1, our kindness shall not prove injury either to the object of our charity or to others. That's number 1. Okay. So Robin Hood, go
rob the rich to
soak your head, right? Because he's robbing the rich to give to the poor.
Would you say the charity can't hurt the object of the charity?
Or others.
Okay.
So it also can't hurt the object of the charity. And I think this is one of the argument a lot of people give before giving to the homeless is that they're just going to use it for drugs, right? They assume that their gift of money will actually be harmful and will further an addiction.
And so would Cicero agree with that? It sounds like it.
If it's true.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many times it's actually true. And how do you differentiate as a giver? I think it's a better policy to give indiscriminately than it is to be tight-fisted and then only give, say, sandwiches. I mean, it'd probably be better to give food and coffee and goods to these people that they can actually use rather than money they can
use for whatever purposes. But there's also something ennobling about saying, you are asking for money, I'm going to give you money because I trust to make the decision. And if they make the bad decision, kind of so be it, as opposed to you saying, well, I know exactly what is better for you, so I'm going to circumvent your ask and give you something different.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So I think we can talk about how Christian principles apply to this in a second, because he says some other stuff that you guys might take issue with.
Okay, cool.
Number 2, it can't be beyond our own means.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because it damages the next of kin.
Yeah.
Like, if I give way too much, then my kids get no inheritance. And it might engender a passion for plundering and misappropriating property. So if I give a bunch, that's where Robin Hood came in, is he was giving so much, and then he's like, you know what, I should plunder some other people to give some more property. And then you start using property for the wrong means, and you might go a little too far, and you hurt your family. That was his criteria number 2. Criteria number 3, and this is the one where it's a little strange. It has to be proportioned to the worthiness of the recipient.
Yeah.
Under 4 headings: his moral character, his attitude towards us, the intimacy of his relation to us, and any services he has rendered to us.
Yeah, I feel that would be the one where Christian charity diverges from this, because
we would say give regardless of the recipient.
Yeah, I mean,
I will say, I just finished, it wasn't a good book, so I won't name it, but they had something in there to that same effect of, they were telling a story about how one person who they gave food to was, very kind and thankful, and another person was just very angry, and so they gave more money to the first person than the second person. So, I don't think that's good as a moral principle, but as a matter of expediency, I don't know. Is that a helpful thing to know?
Rewarding the behavior that you want to...
Yeah, or that people will be more likely to want to reward behavior. Not to say this is the way things should be, but just as a statement of this is how things are.
I also think Christianity says, be kind to your enemy, right, and even be charitable to them, which has no place in his, prescriptions for charity. But I think there's also an inherent element of giving in which we do this. You are going to give a better Christmas present to the friends and family that are close to you versus the people you don't know that well. It would be really weird to give a really extravagant birthday present to one of your students and then give paltry stuff to the rest of your family. That'd be strange. Yeah. And I think that he's trying to recognize that as best he can. But that's not a full excuse. I think we are called as Christians to give as much as we have, right?
I guess I'm thinking of something...
Even to robbers.
Right. And I'm thinking of something much more specific when he says charity, but this isn't only to I'm using air quotes, the needy. This is charity toward everyone.
Yeah.
Correct? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then that's helpful to bring that
Is it
in.
worthwhile giving the definition of charity? So that we all know.
To define it?
In modern context, when we say charity, we generally mean the giving of money or the giving of money to the poor, or
that's
to, quote, charitable donations.
That's the first definition, voluntary giving of help, typically in the form of money to those in need.
Christian virtue of charity is the love that expects nothing in return. So Christ dying on the cross was the ultimate act of charity. We could not give anything in return for his outpouring of love. So when Christians, at least classically, are talking about caritas, when they're talking about charity, they mean a love without any strings, a love without expecting anything in return. That has one of the easiest ways to probably see that is in the giving of money to people that cannot in any way pay it back or give you anything back.
Right.
And the same thing that Christ dying on the cross for us is the act of charity. There's nothing that we can do to like make it better, or there's nothing we can do except give your heart, give everything, give your entire existence. So Cicero's not talking about Christian charity. He's not talking about love, which doesn't expect anything in return. He's mainly
I don't think so, especially because he talks about return. He says, gratitude you must serve. If people have rendered you a service, you have to give them gratitude in proportion to the service they've rendered to you. And he talks a lot about the fraternity of human men and how society is best served when you give stuff to the people that are closest to you. And it does not seem to be strictly similar to that of Christianity.
So
but I do think there's an element of recognizing that we do tend to give more to the people that we know and we tend to give less to the people that we don't.
So is there a place for having both principles operating in your life at the same time, or are they mutually exclusive? Like, is Christian charity mutually exclusive of Cicero charity? Because Cicero's saying you kind of rank people in your mind, and people who are it's not friendly, but the people who for whom you would get a better return, you should give more to. Like, he's talking about it in a very sort of practical, almost like the old boys club business meetings kind of charity. Is there a place for having both of those things operate at the same time, or do you have to pick one or the other?
There has to be some type of ranking. This is the point you all have made in various ways, but if you were to prioritize a spouse equally to a stranger in the street, that would be, there's a problem with that.
Yeah.
But Graham, when you then add that part of because you get more return from them, that's the part that that's the part that feels uncomfortable to me. Like, we should give more charity to certain people based on like the closeness to us, but it's not because we get something from them. So is it almost like the melding of the Cicero?
I guess
affection?
I also just think about it in terms of how do you allocate your time to friends?
Same. Yeah.
How do you choose which people that you're going to spend spend the limited amount of time that you have in a day, in a week, in a lifetime? How do you allocate that? Well, we are doing some kind of analysis where we say, well, this group of people gets the lion's share versus this group of people because of whatever the reasons are. I don't think it's just purely completely neutral altruistic charity where everyone gets sort of an equal share of you. I don't know. It's the it's the altruism of the faith mixed with kind of like the practicalities of still being a human.
Well, I think the issue is that Cicero is coming from a self-interested perspective, right, where it is okay to show a little bit of self-interest. And I think one of the primary principles of Christianity is self-forgetfulness and the interest in others. And so I think it depends on what kind of charity you're talking about. If it's charity motivated by need, that is a very different thing than charity motivated by personal love.
Sure.
And in both cases, you should give deference to that person who perhaps needs you more and give less preference to your own proclivities. So spend more time with the people who might need your time, perhaps more than those that you enjoy spending time with. And I think that when we see people do that, we see it as noble, right? The kid who is popular, who gives his time to the unpopular kids, we think is awesome, versus the kid who's popular, who gives his time to the popular kids.
Sure.
Right? And so I think our charity, rather than being motivated by self-interest and level of good done to us, should always be motivated by self-forgetfulness and need. Right? Give more to somebody who needs more. right? If I have goods that I don't need and my family doesn't need, and he needs them, they should go to him. They're God's goods, not my goods, right?
Sure.
That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking, what about like when you're hiring for a job? Like if before Magby comes on, we interview Magby, and he is as qualified to do the job as anybody, but we also have we want to hang around him. We think we also think this job's going to be really great for him, and it's really great for us because that means we get to hang out with him more. And then you do what is it? Is that an example of doing the charitable thing? Is preferring and giving the job to Magby over anybody else? Is that what Cicero's getting at?
But I mean, if we're just talking about hiring practices, and we might be a little off the road here, audience, sorry, but I think you have to consider the needs of your company, and the needs of your company is a positive working environment for the faculty. And then if the faculty are happy and love their environment, that will extend to the students and the families, right? The need here is for a solid, unified, genial faculty, not necessarily for, right? When I hire, I am not concerned necessarily for that person's well-being, but the well-being of the whole.
This is all making me want to, I've only ever read excerpts of it, but it makes me want to read City of God, Augustine's City of God, because I feel like this is the tension we get to of like, there are spiritual ideals that we hold, but we do also live in a fallen world. And so there are times when we will look to practical things. This is Aristotle saying that there are different types of friendships, not to say that one is like better than the other, but each has different uses. Mm-hmm. So in the same way here, like different people, but I hate saying that people have uses, but it's kind of what Cicero is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that concludes the discussion of society. So far we've talked about the pursuit and development of the true. We've talked about conserving an organized society, which falls under justice, making sure everybody gets their due, and charity, which is fraternity and giving to one another. And then the third is greatness and strength of a noble and invincible spirit.
Love it.
Cool.
This one falls kind of in a weird spot for me, especially because the fourth, which we'll get to in a minute, is orderliness and moderation of everything that is said and done, wherein consists temperance and self-control.
It's very to the point. It's not.
Yeah. Everything that's said
title.
And done seems pretty broad, especially when we've just had 3 divisions of stuff. Mm-hmm. The delineation to me gets a little squiffy. It seems like it might have been easier to organize it different ways, but I'm no Cicero. So let's keep talking on greatness and strength of a noble and invincible spirit. He talks about how the rabble see greatness and that tends to deal with fame primarily, but fame often ends in injustice and self-focus. So we should not necessarily look to the famous. That doesn't necessarily mean a truly great or courageous man. It means a popular one.
Amen.
Right? Which is not the same thing.
It's not.
And he says a soul that is courageous and great is marked by 2 characteristics. You guys ready? You guys ready to figure out if you're courageous and great right now? Audience, are you guys ready? Because this might be...
I feel like the answer... Anyway.
It might be a little rough for you.
Yes, that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, I feel like I'm probably there.
Okay. Well, let's hear what those 2 are.
All right.
Yeah, okay.
Number 1, they are indifferent to outward circumstances. Such a person cherishes a conviction that nothing but moral goodness and propriety deserve to be admired or wished for. That's distinguished by 2 criteria. It accounts for moral rectitude as the only good, and they are free from all passion. So
that's all the first one.
Okay, I'm 1 for 2 so far.
Okay. And number 2, when the soul is disciplined, one does deeds useful and arduous and laborious and fraught with danger. So these 2 things aren't necessarily 2 characteristics, but 1 is the cause and 2 is the result. So 1 is indifferent to outward circumstances. They are convinced that nothing but moral goodness and propriety deserve their effort. It means they're free from passion, and moral rectitude is the only good. And then when that's true, they will do deeds that are useful and difficult and fraught with danger.
This sounds like Socrates, right? Like that's the, cold nor heat bothers him. Like nothing bothers him, and he was a great soldier because he was sort of indifferent to whatever happened to him, and seeking after the moral truth was all that he wanted, wisdom. I have thought about, yes, I don't wish that our lives had more danger, but there is definitely, maybe it's after sitting in a classroom for an entire year, a school year, you're just like, man, I wish I was hiking or outside or encountering wild animals, or so. There's something about testing oneself against the elements or against something that is dangerous that does also seem to have a bearing on the good.
Mm-hmm.
So Hannenberg, did you pass the test?
I am not indifferent, and I would not say that I do dangerous things. So I guess I think it stretches us to call, what do we call teaching dangerous? Like we're engaging with ideas as opposed to the dangerous things outside of us.
But this is a safe space, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we advertise, right? Veritas, a safe space. No, of course not. I don't know if I'd call that dangerous, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think, and I'm not sure how much I agree fully with this.
I agree that indifference is a virtue. That indifference is necessary for the invincible spirit.
Maybe. So I could see how this could make a really great citizen, but I don't think. Does this describe a great husband? Does this describe a great leader of a company or leader of a team? This describes a great individual contributor. I just don't know how they would work together with other people.
I think
it sounds like a robot, doesn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think it's somebody that is definitely going to be in tune and be able to interact with a world of unknowns. So if you, I've been reading Shelby Foote's History of the Civil War, and taken with the character of Ulysses S. Grant, at least as a general. I know he apparently wasn't a very good president, but I haven't got there yet. But just he has this, there's this one scene where his troops are badly beaten one day, and one of his sort of beleaguered brigadier generals comes up to him and is like, "Man, we sure got licked today, didn't we, General?" And he's like, "Yep. We'll lick him tomorrow." He's just got this indifference to the disaster that happens in front of you, and then also a not taking too seriously the victory. There's the nothing is ever really as good or really as bad as you think it is kind of mentality, which I think is kind of a healthy one. I think there's something, Cicero's onto something when he is saying that is a key characteristic of the invincible spirit is. And we all sort of chuckled and laughed at his dying words, but I think that's an example of it.
Right.
What you were doing is wrong, but make sure that you kill me rightly. You do a good job of it. There's something that just makes us go, hot dang, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that is what he's getting at with this idea of the indifference.
Isn't there, as one that tends to step out of situations and look at them analytically and critically, isn't there something to be said for the unity of the emotional life of a man and the intellectual life of a man? Aren't there moments where we should be angry, and to not feel anger would show a deficiency in us rather than a true plus? And this is a personal thing. I've been trying to improve in this because I am detached.
I don't think indifference is the same thing as detachment, and I don't think indifference is the same thing as not being invested emotionally in something. And I don't think the indifferent person is the robot. So I think you can be incredibly disappointed when something doesn't go your way, and I also think you can be incredibly elated when something does go your way. But when the emotion passes, being able to sort of categorize it as, okay, this isn't everything. This hasn't finished my life for the positive after some sort of elation, or this hasn't finished my life for the negative after some sort of disappointment. I think there needs to be when the emotion passes, there is a sort of categorizing of indifferent, that this is another thing that happened and I'm going to take it, and now what am I going to do next?
And I think
that's not a detachment. I think a detachment is actually detachment is a
refusal to feel emotions that should be there? A refusal
to feel emotions, and maybe is knowing that you actually are not very good at dealing with negative emotions, therefore I am not going to engage emotionally. I think indifference is allowing yourself to feel it and then putting in its proper place when the emotion's done.
So I think what you're advocating for is a healthy estimation of the emotions when they occur, rather than a rejection of the emotions wholesale.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so so let yourself get carried away in the moment. Scream and yell in joy when you win the battle. But then when you're done, don't fool yourself into thinking that you've won the war or that you can ride your coattails for the rest of the campaign because of this one victory.
And as you're screaming and yelling in joy, don't let yourself get out of control, and know that this is only a battle.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yes. I don't know if I've never read Cicero, so I don't know if that's what he's getting at, but when
you
I think
say,
that would be my estimation of.
But when you say indifference, I don't think people think that.
Yeah.
Or when the Stoic ideal of apatheia, that to hear apathy is not to think, yes, I actually do feel emotions, but then go back to normal.
Yeah, and that's the retort that everyone says when someone is really buying into the apathy of the Stoics. It's like, man, do not want to be married to that person.
Right. It doesn't sound fun. Or healthy, or pick your adjective.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe also Cicero, I don't know, but there's also something to be said of the separation of the public and the private life. That you can have, that you can be completely overcome with emotion about your spouse, but and have that be, and not have an indifference there, but have an indifference to sort of the way that you engage yourself publicly. I think there's something healthy to that too.
Yeah.
Again, with reading Shelby Foote, I'm struck with how tender Stonewall Jackson's letters are to his wife, and how stone-faced and sort of like almost cruel he is to his soldiers and whatnot. But anyway,
Yeah. Okay, there's a few more little notes in here that I had under this heading of greatness and strength of a noble and invincible spirit. So he gives you the criteria for what makes one, and that's, indifference to outward circumstances, and you do difficult deeds. He also says that the unperturbed, or those who would do as they please, either aim for power, so they can do what they please, or detachment, right? So they want everything so they can do whatever they want to, or they aim to be pleased with what they have so they can do whatever they want. But he says that both can tend towards some sort of defect, right? The one, power, falls into the temptation of glory, recklessness, and wealth. The other falls into, sorry, I lost my spot. The other falls into despising work or toil and oversensitivity. So I can be okay with what I have, but that might make me lazy in getting the goods that my family and I both deserve. And if I'm going to have as much means as I want to do whatever I'd like to, that can also tend to go towards wealth and power and cruelty and tyranny and all those things.
So this is a always be a little bit hungry kind of sentiment?
Yes. So
maybe, or just aim for a mean. Like if you are aiming to have it all, know that you don't have to have absolutely everything, and to guard against those pitfalls that come with aiming towards wealth or aiming towards power and letting that do what you want to do. And if you're aimed to be detached from all those things and not hang on to your physical possessions and to just be satisfied, really, then don't let that become an excuse for laziness, which I think is fair.
Yeah.
He then goes into a long discussion of warfare and what sort of man should work in war. And he also says we should hold highly those men who work in peace. Right? Lycurgus, the guy who set down the law for Spartans, he did that in peacetime. And his work matters far more than the Spartans, than any general who ever lived. Or at least that lawmaking affects more people and at more times. So he says we should never look at just the generals as the height. And I think this is kind of a Roman thing, right? They really overemphasized war and made it this big thing in their culture. And so to not talk about it at length, especially to one's son, would not be as valuable. He also says men who aim to politics must keep in mind two rules. First, keep the good of the people before your own, right? At all times, you're working for the good of the people. And second, and this is a fun one, to care for the whole body politic and not only a few. If you care for only your part or your own party, you introduce dissension and party strife. So everyone going into politics should be caring for all the people, not just their own party. I wonder.
He's right, isn't he?
I think he's absolutely right, but it just makes me depressed that our parties are so opposed right now.
Yeah.
It makes me sad. And I wanted to read you guys the last quote here because it's pretty cool. In this section, to revert to the original question, we must decide that the most important activities, those most indicative of a great spirit, are performed by the men who direct the affairs of nations. For such public activities have the widest scope and touch the lives of the most people. But even in the life of retirement, there are, and there have been, many high-souled men who have been engaged in important inquiries or embarked on most important enterprises and yet kept themselves within the limits of their own affairs. Or taking some middle course between philosophers on the one hand and statesmen on the other, they were content with managing their own property. not increasing it by any and every means, nor debarring their kindred from the enjoyment of it, but rather, if ever there were need, sharing it with their friends and with the state. Only let in the first place, be honestly acquired. Only let it in the first place be honestly acquired by the use of no dishonest or fraudulent means. Let it in the second place increase by wisdom, industry, and thrift. And finally, let it be made available for the use of as many as possible, if only they are worthy, and be at the service of generosity and beneficence rather than of sensuality and excess. By observing these rules, one may live in magnificence, dignity, and independence, and yet in honor, truth, and charity toward all.
I buy it. I'm in.
I like it. Yeah.
And then he goes to the last part, which is orderliness and moderation of everything that is said and done, wherein consists temperance and self-control.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
No, I'm down too.
This
This is funny as a catch-all. It's like the miscellaneous category, right? It's like, here's everything else I had to say.
Yeah.
Well, it's to his son. Think about it. It's like, all right, and don't drink too much.
Yeah, it's propriety.
Just go to the party. Don't be the party there, son.
To employ reason and speech rationally, to do with careful consideration whatever one does, and in everything to discern the truth and to uphold it, that is proper. To be mistaken or led astray, that's improper. Justice? Proper. Injustice? Improper.
Good.
He has classifications of propriety. There's the general sort, which is found in moral goodness as a whole. And then there's that belongs to the several divisions of moral goodness. Propriety is that which harmonizes with man's superiority in those respects in which his nature differs from that of the rest of animal creation. So I don't know. It seemed to me like his definition of propriety was a little bit squiffy. He got justice in there. He got being led astray. I guess he's connecting that to the previous spots. So maybe propriety is also closely akin to duty. This is where the divisions kind of broke down to me. I didn't really understand how this was specifically different than everything else. He talks a lot about human nature and how that we should follow. Like there are some things that are terrible that we talk about in public. Murder, right? Thievery. Those are horrible things, but we're totally okay to talk about them. There are things that are totally fine that we don't talk about in public. Conception, right? Mm-hmm. That's weird in public situations, but we're fine to talk about murder. He's like, this thing is weird. And apparently there were philosophers who were like, this is stupid. We should talk a lot about conception and never about murder. And he's like, those guys are idiots. Because our nature tells us that one is okay to talk about in public and the other is not. And then he gives
it's like a defense of manners and...
Yeah. That's what it sounds like, yeah.
And then he goes into just a long array of here's how to live well in life. Like,
so is this just like a description of like being a gentleman? A description of
that is exactly what it is.
Being a cultivated, refined person.
Yeah. Appetites must be subject to reason, neither to run ahead from listlessness or lag behind from indolence. You should be calm of soul, never allowing the change brought by fear, joy, or anger. There are two kinds of jokes, one refined and witty, and the other not so much. It should be clear which is which is why us laughing at Doody at the beginning of this podcast is perfect. Kind of funny.
Yeah. Wait,
we're not gentlemen.
I think we are. That was the right thing to laugh at.
Was it?
Really?
No, that was crass.
I think Cicero would say different.
I know.
Yeah, well.
I can feel the ghost of him judging us.
Yeah.
Graham.
I know.
It's me, Cicero.
He says there are two kinds of character for every person. There's your reason, which is common to all man, and then there's your physical ability. Like, some of you are beautiful. Some of you are not. As I gesture to my two fellow podcasters.
I don't know about this.
Disagree.
So in reading this last section, it feels like it'd be the most specific to when Cicero was writing. The quotes you said have all seemed like they apply. Do you think all this still applies today?
A lot of it still applies, I'd say. There's still some stuff here. So here's propriety defined. Again, uniform consistency in the course of our life as a whole and all its individual actions. You can't do this by copying the traits of others and eliminating one's own. So you kind of has to be true to you, I guess, is another part of this. There's also a long discussion about how to choose your lot in life and that it should be something that harmonizes with you. But it's a bummer because we ask kids when they don't know themselves that well and they're still developing to choose their lot in life when they don't know what sort of things they're good at and love and where they tend naturally. He says there's a rare person who's got enough money and time to do that later in life, and some people are just lucky and land in it, but most people are going to land in jobs that they don't necessarily find suitable to them, and then they should keep looking. He says the young tends toward immodesty and craziness, the old tend toward laziness and over luxury, and you should guard against both. there's two types of power of speech, oratory and conversation. And he's like, I have no idea why we just study oratory. Conversation should be studied too. And then he gives a little list of those things.
That's cool.
Should be easy and not dogmatic. Should have the spice of wit. You shouldn't debar others from participating in it. Let everybody have their turn. If it's a serious subject, you should treat it seriously. If humorous, with wit. Above all, watch that you don't betray some defect in your character, which is most likely to occur when you're joking about someone who's not present. Right? You should when administering reproof. Never have actual anger, but sometimes you can fake it. I think as teachers, you've been there. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Where you're not supposed to actually be angry, but you can be like, Jeffrey, put that down. Right? So, I mean, there's just lots of sort of small things here, right? And then it discusses seasoning things to individual occasions and all that stuff. The last part...
Why don't we read this? We should read this.
In class?
Life. In school.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
I have stuff to say about it.
In the next sections or in this section?
I disagree with what you said.
The last part, he says, how do you decide what is more requiring of your duty? Right? Remember, I talked about that, how there was going to be, how do you choose between two things? He says, duties prescribed by justice and that have to do with our fellow men get precedence over the pursuit of knowledge and any duties imposed by that. If I am seeking the mysteries of the universe and then a friend comes in and he's like, hey man, I'm having a hard time, I should always defer to the friend or those things that my country requires or my society requires over...
You disagree with that?
No, that one I actually kind of agree with. I actually agree with it fairly wholeheartedly.
Right.
The part I kind of wonder about is Cicero goes even so far as to say, watch how you walk. Don't walk too fast. People think it's weird. Don't walk too slow. You'll look lazy. Right there, he goes really far on how to act. He also talks about effeminacy of gesture and effeminacy of dress. He says you shouldn't dress overly nice as to appear effeminate. You shouldn't dress too slovenly. You should aim for some sort of middle mean. And I'm not saying that those things are bad, but I'm saying that these feel like the things that can change with culture and those things that a strict adherence to can sometimes get you into trouble. He talks about how we treat one's slaves. And when talking about jobs, he talked about how you should never, ever go for a menial job that does not require intelligence or artistry. Right? Like a garbage man.
Loyal listener Graham Donaldson is smiling to himself right now.
I'm just thinking that this is like the Bible and manuscript of the 19th century British gentleman.
Yes.
And that's what causes me pause, is that some of those things we've done away with for a reason.
It's because you're blue-collar America.
Partially, yes. And partially because, right, think about France, right? How they for a while had the aristocracy, and what was right and appropriate in the aristocracy was, as a king, to get dressed in the morning in front of all of your followers, was to look down upon and even deride the common rabble. It was
but he was
sometimes propriety can go way too far and can require of us things that are not good. And I think in those cases, we should absolutely defer to the dignity of man as a whole and towards charity and self-deprecation above all, right?
But isn't that why that's in the moderation section?
So there's a place for propriety. Well, is propriety a virtue?
No, he's just saying like, don't be too fancy, but don't be too sloppy.
So even Cicero would condemn the King of France for doing that, for dressing like that.
But the thing is I'm not sure he would. He would according to his own culture, but if he had lived with the King of France, I think he would be trying to find some middle mean within that culture, and I think that's where we get into trouble, is when culture takes precedence over the real draw of what is actually right and true. And I think sometimes this can happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
The King of France is wrong.
Okay, but...
And Cicero would say that.
Cicero would say that, but would a
Not
French philosopher at the same
France.
exact time?
So,
and that's my issue, is that
Yes.
I advocate for being aware of how your culture affects those around you and how those small cultural requirements can sometimes be detrimental towards honesty, truth, and charity towards fellow men. I think that sometimes manners can be this, right? If someone makes a manners faux pas, puts their elbows on a table, they are derided when really they might be the kindest person in the room, right? I think sometimes these things go too far, and that strict adherence to them can reduce the dignity of man rather than bringing us all towards a higher dignity.
I have a hard time saying that we currently live in a time where we take our manners too seriously.
I didn't say now was that time. I said it can be, and that those manners can often get us into trouble. I think now it's not necessarily like I've been in places where manners are too highly regarded, and then me being an unmannered oaf make some misstep. That's my own fault. But I think now perhaps call it political correctness. That's a certain type of manners, and that's one that does often prevent us from saying what is good and true in the face of what is not good and true. Okay. And I think people on both sides would agree with that.
Fair enough.
I would say that is our cultural manner and one that can get us into trouble. Graham is uncomfortable because
I don't think that's what Cicero's getting at well, maybe it is. I don't know if political correctness is a manners thing. I think there's an underlying sort of
I think Cicero would have advocated
philosophy for it. But anyway.
From what I read today, it seems like Cicero would have been the watch and make sure you don't overstep those bounds. And I think sometimes a man trying to be true and good must overstep his culture.
Yes, you would agree with that. So sometimes the culture around you will want something other than virtuous behavior.
Sure, but he's talking about he's enshrining some kind of idea of a timeless gentleman.
And ironically, most of what was described sounds like a timeless gentleman, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's fine.
Yep.
And I have no problem with it.
But I can't think of a time where you would want to where stepping out of being a timeless gentleman is good, or is making some sort of, or is necessary to make some sort of other sort of point in the culture.
What do you mean?
Well, you're talking. I've just thought of this. I can't put it. I haven't fully fleshed out in my own mind, so maybe I'll have to save it for later.
Okay, that's fine. To do a quick review, you have the 4 subheadings. You have full perception and development of the true. You have conservation of an organized society. You have the greatness of strength of a noble and invincible spirit, which is pretty much being indifferent and then doing hard things. And then orderliness and moderation of everything that you do. So you have be smart and don't be led astray. Be kind to others, observe justice and charity, do hard things with an indifferent spirit, and in all other things, be generally a gentleman. And I think that's a pretty good collection of what he says. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, remember, the call of your friends and your country should be over the call of knowledge in general. And that's book 1, folks. That's Cicero.
Cool. That's good.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Well, this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. We hope that you have felt the stirring of nobility deep in your hearts to elevate yourself into a more refined and civilized way of existing without pompousness, and also without being a jerkbag about it. If you have questions or concerns,
I got a good quote about that. Sorry, it was from Julius Caesar. When we talked about him, I think I read this quote: "To comment on the want of breeding of someone else shows that one lacks it as much himself." I think to comment on the lack of breeding and refinement of someone else shows you want it just as much. I think that's maybe a good guide for this.
I think so too.
Be refined, but don't use it as a way to deride others.
Good. If you have comments, questions, or concerns, or wish to share ways that you have elevated your nobility, please email us at classicalstuff@veritasacademy.net. You can tweet at us at classicalstuff, and I will like it and retweet it and say silly things back to you. If you want to find our website, it is classicalstuff.net, where you can find all of our episodes, tiny little bios that were written a long time ago, funky pictures of us.
Yes.
And
if you'd like to donate to us, we promise to remain indifferent.
That's right. We will not let it rule our lives, and we will only moderately. No, if you maybe if you want to give us money, let us know. But we thank you for listening to us. This makes me want to go find a copy of Cicero and get reading. This Classical Stuff. Signing off.
Thanks. Bye.